The morning sky over the royal plaza in Syria was unnaturally still, like the quiet before a storm. There was something unnatural about it, a tension that hung just beneath the surface. Zarek stood at the edge of the plaza, his boots scraping against the smooth crystal pavement as he walked toward the heart of the Imperial Palace. He had spent 3 days in this foreign world, 3 days doing what he did best, fixing things. But the problem with fixing things, Zarek knew, was that you couldn't always see the damage until it was too late. The explosion hit with a thunderous force, shattering the stillness in an instant. The violent shockwave rolled through the air, rippling the very fabric of reality. Crystal towers that had once gleamed like prisms under the twin suns now crumbled into jagged shards, their beauty destroyed in a single moment. Debris rained down in all directions, casting a shower of light across the plaza. People, no, locals, scattered like startled birds, their violet skins flashing in the chaos. The sound of frantic feet pounding the streets echoed across the plaza, but Zarek didn't flinch. He didn't run. The smoke from his pipe curled up around his face, cutting through the stench of burning stone and twisted metal. With slow, deliberate steps, he made his way toward the center of the destruction, his gaze steady and unfazed. The chaos was nothing new to him. Chaos was something Zarek had learned to live with, even thrive in. Perfect timing, he muttered to himself, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. His eyes never left the plume of smoke rising from the twisted wreckage of the Imperial Palace's eastern wing. Behind him, a swarm of security drones filled the sky, their blue scanning beams crisscrossing the air like angry fireflies. They hovered in perfect formation, their artificial eyes searching for something, or perhaps someone, to blame. Zarek wasn't the one they were looking for. But he didn't mind. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time had a certain charm to it. He could already feel it, the sharp edge of a suspicion, like a blade just waiting to cut through his skin. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to witness what he was about to witness. But Zarek was always in the wrong place, and that was where the real story began. With a smooth motion, he reached into his coat pocket, producing a match. Striking it against the heel of his boot, he inhaled deeply. The familiar warmth spread through his chest as the pipe came to life in his hands. Humanitarian work, Zarek said softly, glancing around at the smoldering ruins. Guess I've been doing this a little too long. A voice broke through the smoke, metallic and cold. Citizen. Remain stationary. Zarek turned to find 3 guards in front of him, their violet ceremonial armor gleaming under the harsh light of the explosion. Their faces were obscured by purple masks, the only indication of life those faint, pulsing implants at their temples. What's the matter? Zarek asked, raising an eyebrow, his hands still in his pockets. Don't tell me I'm under arrest for fixing things. You are under arrest for the explosion, the lead guard replied, his voice devoid of emotion. Zarek blinked. Explosion? What explosion? The guard didn't answer. Instead, a holographic screen flickered to life in front of him, displaying grainy footage. It was Zarek, or someone who looked like him, examining a device. A detonation device, as the footage suggested. He felt a chill run down his spine. Wait a second, this isn't me. Zarek took a step forward, his mind racing. I was at the relief station. I was recalibrating water purifiers all morning. Your presence at the relief station ended at 7 a.m., the guard responded, his voice flat. This footage is timestamped 7:23 a.m. Zarek's stomach twisted. The footage was undeniably of someone who looked like him. But there was no way he had been involved in whatever was happening here. He tried to calm himself, to focus. There must be a mistake. There are witnesses, tracking data. Your trial begins in 57 minutes, the guard interrupted. Your sentence has already been determined. Zarek's mind raced. Wait, what trial? He demanded. What are you talking about? I was just helping. The guard turned to leave, signaling for Zarek to follow. You will undergo the reprogramming ritual. Zarek froze. Reprogramming? He repeated the word, his voice tinged with disbelief. What the hell does that mean? It is efficient, the guard responded. The Empress will handle your case personally. A cold shiver ran through Zarek's body. He had heard whispers, stories of how the Velerian Empire controlled its citizens not with laws or punishments, but through reprogramming their minds, purging them of anything deemed unsuitable. Zarek had always chalked it up to urban legend, a fear tactic used to keep the population in line. But now, as the words hit him with full force, Zarek realized that he wasn't just an engineer in a foreign land anymore. He was a prisoner, and the cost of his freedom was about to be far higher than anything he had ever imagined. Zarek was led down a corridor that was more polished crystal than it was material. His reflection danced in the walls, fractured into 1,000 pieces. No corners, no edges, just smooth, cold curves that left him feeling like he was drifting, lost in a maze of his own mind. Then, he was thrown into a holding cell carved from a single block of amethyst, the walls so smooth he could barely make out his own distorted reflection. There was no escape here, not from his surroundings, and not from the thoughts swirling in his mind. Great, Zarek muttered, pacing the floor. I'm in another goddamn cage. The door slid open, and in stepped a figure, regal and unbending. The official had silver robes that flowed like mercury, but it wasn't the robes that made Zarek pause, it was the sheer weight of the presence in the room. This was a woman who held the Empire in her hands, someone who could erase him without a second thought. Prisoner, she said, her voice cold as steel. I am Judicial Procurator Velnath. Your trial commences in 1 hour. Zarek barely looked at her. Trial? No, no trial. There's been a misunderstanding. I didn't blow anything up. His eyes flicked over her robes, then back to her eyes, watching for a sign of weakness. You want to know what happened? You've got the wrong guy. I fix things, not blow them up. The official's voice remained flat. You proposed replacing a Class 7 hyperreactor with a kettle and rope. Zarek shook his head in disbelief. That was a joke. A test to show how overthinking things can break systems. It was a demonstration of failure, not a blueprint for destruction. You proposed it nonetheless, Velnath replied, pushing a tablet toward him. The screen flickered to life, showing footage of Zarek, of someone who looked like him, examining a strange device. No. That's not me. Zarek said, his voice rising in frustration. He took a step forward, pressing his hand to the screen. I was working at the relief station all morning. The footage doesn't match what happened. Your presence at the relief station ended at 7 a.m., Velnath said, his voice mechanical. This footage is timestamped 7:23 a.m. Zarek's mind swirled, his thoughts racing. This doesn't make sense. There must be something I can do, something. You will undergo the reprogramming ritual with Her Imperial Majesty, Velnath said, cutting him off. You will be made useful. For the Empire. Zarek exhaled sharply, his thoughts slowing as he processed the words. Reprogramming, he whispered. What the hell are you people doing to your citizens? As the door slid shut behind him, Zarek's thoughts turned inward, his mind grappling with the true implications of his situation. He was in the heart of a system that didn't just control actions, it controlled minds. The Zephyria Empire, for all its grandeur, had built its entire foundation on a lie. A lie of control, of suppressing human nature and bending it to the will of the Empire. This was a place where emotion was a disease, a malady to be purged, and where free will was a dangerous, foreign concept. Zarek had always known that there were places in the galaxy where freedom was an illusion, but seeing it firsthand, feeling it now in the weight of his imprisonment, made it painfully real. And then, there was Lyra. Her calm exterior, her icy demeanor, Zarek could see through it, though. He had been around long enough to know when someone was holding something back, and in Lyra, he saw a woman who was locked inside her own mind, unable to escape the chains of her own empire. What would it take to make her see? What would it take to make the entire Zephyria Empire realize that peace, true peace, couldn't come from suppressing the very nature of what it means to be alive? To feel, to think, to make mistakes and learn from them, this was the essence of humanity. Zarek's mind wandered to the past. To Earth. To the moment he had left his home behind, knowing that the price of his existence there was too high, the pressure too great. And yet here, in this strange, alien place, he saw the same thing, the same insidious need for control, for stability at the cost of freedom. It was the same story, just written in different language. He let out a slow breath, one filled with resolve. The truth is, he muttered to himself, peace can't come from suppression. Not from controlling people's minds, their hearts. It comes from a balance that lets them choose, lets them live. Zarek lay awake on the smooth, violet floor of his holding cell, staring up at the smooth, featureless ceiling. It was strange how, in a place so carefully engineered, there was nothing to grasp, nothing to hold on to. The walls curved around him like the hollow shell of some ancient, forgotten creature. There were no sharp edges here, nothing to distinguish one part of the cell from the other. The idea, Zarek suspected, was to keep him isolated. To make him feel both trapped and invisible. He had been alone in this cell for hours, his thoughts spiraling, his pulse still heavy with the intensity of his last encounter with the Zephyria guards. What was going on? How had his mission to help the people of this empire turned into something far darker, far more complex? But it wasn't just the mission that was consuming him. No, it was her, the Empress. Zarek had barely spoken to her, and yet, in those brief moments, something had shifted. He had seen it in her eyes, a flicker of something that wasn't quite emotion, but something close, something he couldn't place. It was more than curiosity. It was the look of someone who had been so locked in a world of control and order that even the smallest touch of humanity was enough to throw her entire sense of reality into turmoil. That something he had seen in her was exactly what had been hidden beneath the layers of control that defined the Zephyria Empire. It was a rebellion. But it wasn't a rebellion against him, it was a rebellion against the walls she had built around herself, walls that had been there long before he had ever stepped foot in this place. The door slid open again, the sharp hiss of the mechanism slicing through the stillness of the room. Zarek didn't bother to look up. He had grown accustomed to the cold, emotionless routines of the guards, their robotic movements, their lack of any discernible human warmth. But this time, the figure that entered was different. Empress Lyra stepped into the cell, her presence filling the space in a way that made the air feel denser, more electric. Her silver hair was now unbound, flowing like liquid moonlight around her shoulders. The soft glow from the crystal walls seemed to dance off her skin, accentuating her already striking features. She was magnificent, yes, but there was something else in her eyes, something raw, something that made Zarek stop breathing for a moment. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she studied him, her gaze sharp and calculating, as if she were trying to piece together a puzzle she had no interest in solving. Her gaze lingered on him, but she said nothing for a long while. "You're a troublemaker," she finally said, her voice cool and melodic, but carrying a note of something else, something unspoken, almost as if she were admitting that she was more curious than she was willing to admit. Zarek chuckled dryly, sitting up and leaning against the curved wall. Troublemaker. He grinned, the playful smirk tugging at his lips. I'm just a mechanic. You'd be surprised how much trouble a few pieces of equipment can cause when you fix them. Lyra didn't respond right away. Instead, she stepped closer, her presence heavy and oppressive in the small space. There was a tension between them now, unspoken, yet undeniable. Zarek couldn't help but notice how different she was from the image he had initially formed of her in his mind. He had expected a ruler, cold, distant, unapproachable, but what he saw now was a woman, still carrying the weight of an empire on her shoulders, yet somehow, a woman who was beginning to question everything she had ever known. You didn't answer me, Lyra said after a pause, her eyes narrowing slightly. Why are you so different from everyone else here? Why do you refuse to just conform to the system? Zarek leaned back against the wall, his hands clasped behind his head. Isn't that the point? He asked, his voice casual, but the question itself was a challenge. To never conform. What would happen to a society that just follows? That never asks why. Lyra's gaze hardened, but there was a flicker of something beneath the surface, a recognition, perhaps. The system works, she said, almost as if she were trying to convince herself as much as him. It brings order, stability. It prevents chaos. It prevents feeling. Zarek raised an eyebrow. That's the problem, isn't it? Feeling is dangerous. It's messy. It's unpredictable. But without it, what are we? He shifted his position, turning his body slightly toward her. You can control minds, control actions, but you can't control why people do what they do. Not really. You can suppress it, but that only makes it worse. At least that's what I've learned back on Earth. Lyra took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. And what do you think you can teach me? You're a human, a species that can barely control its emotions, that destroys itself in the name of passion. What makes you think you understand anything about peace or order? Zarek's smile faded slightly, the weight of her words sinking in. Maybe because I'm not afraid of feeling anymore, he said quietly, his voice softer now. Maybe because it's the one thing you can't control, and it's the one thing that's always been there. You can't destroy it. Not without breaking yourself first. Lyra's eyes flickered, just for a moment, before she turned away, her posture stiffening as if she were reasserting her control over the situation. But Zarek had seen it, the brief hesitation, the hint of something breaking through her perfect facade. What do you think would happen, Empress? Zarek asked, his voice low, dangerous now. If your people learned how to feel, if they stopped hiding behind their implants, behind their systems of control. Lyra didn't answer right away. She stood still, her back straight, looking out toward the horizon beyond the crystal walls. For a moment, she almost seemed lost in thought, lost in a world where she didn't have to be perfect, where she didn't have to carry the weight of her entire empire. Zarek, ever the observer, noted the subtle shift in her. It was there, if you looked closely, a crack in the ice. A flicker of humanity in a woman who had been taught to suppress it her entire life. Is that what you want? Lyra asked suddenly, her voice softer now, almost vulnerable. To break me? Zarek smiled, but it wasn't a smug grin this time. It was something else, something more knowing, more understanding. No, Empress. I don't want to break you. I want to show you what it feels like to be free, even for a moment. Because when you're free, you realize something, all that control, all that order, is just a cage. And you're just another prisoner. Lyra's gaze lingered on him, and for the first time since Zarek had met her, he saw something flicker in her eyes. A deep, ancient conflict. And in that moment, as the walls around them seemed to close in and the air itself thickened with the weight of unspoken words, Zarek understood that this connection between them, was going to change everything. It wasn't just about the Empire anymore. It was about them. The Empire that had been built on suppression, the very system that made it strong, was now the source of its weakness. Control, as Lyra would soon learn, was an illusion. The more the Empire tried to force its citizens to conform, to bury their feelings and instincts, the more it invited rebellion, not from the outside, but from within. And Zarek, the outsider, the one who had always been different, was here to show them that the true meaning of peace was not in the absence of emotion, but in the balance between freedom and guidance. The true test of a society wasn't in its ability to impose control, but in its ability to foster a world where individuals could freely express their humanity without chaos. Zarek had always believed that one moment could change everything. But standing amidst the chaos of Zephyria society's unraveling, he realized how true that was. The explosive force of his arrival, his refusal to conform, had planted a seed that now threatened to grow into something beyond his control. Yet, as much as the thought terrified him, there was a part of him that welcomed it. Because in that seed lay freedom. And if freedom meant the destruction of an empire, then so be it. The first signs of the revolution weren't grand gestures or sweeping speeches. They were small things, insubstantial at first, but powerful in their ability to spread. It began with people feeling. People who had never known what it was like to have emotions, to act on impulse, to question what they had been told for so long. They started to cry, to laugh, to shout in public spaces. The suppression implants, the quiet, ever-present shackles that had defined the Zephyria existence, began to falter, and in their place, a raw, untamed humanity began to emerge. Zarek could feel it in the air. The shift was undeniable. The tension that had once hung over Veleria like a weight now felt like the first breath of air after being submerged underwater. It was jarring, it was unsettling, but it was alive. In the weeks that followed, Zarek found himself at the heart of this chaotic blossoming, watching as society cracked open like a delicate shell. He had spent years on Earth, observing the messy, unpredictable nature of human emotion. He had seen people fall apart, seen them rebuild. He had watched them destroy themselves and then turn around and do it all over again. But this was something different. Veleria was a society that had never known emotion in its raw form. They were all slaves to their systems of control, unable to break free from the rigid walls they had built around themselves. And now, those walls were crumbling. How long do you think it will take? Tina asked one day, her voice low, as she sat next to him in the newly formed safe house, a hideout that had once been a government building but was now a center of rebellion. Zarek glanced over at her, studying her face. Tina had once been a high-ranking officer in the Zephyria military, her implants serving her with perfect precision. But now, those implants were malfunctioning, their once sleek functionality disrupted by the surge of emotions that flooded her system. She was still adapting, still learning how to deal with the new world that was emerging. How long until they realize what's happening? She clarified, her eyes narrowing. Zarek exhaled deeply, watching the people outside as they moved through the streets. For the first time, they weren't just going through motions, they were living. How long? He repeated the question, almost to himself. Longer than we think. It's not just the implants. It's everything, the way they've been raised, the way they've been taught to believe in control over freedom. It's going to take time for them to feel it, for them to really understand what's at stake. Tina's brow furrowed. And what's at stake? Zarek looked at her, his gaze steady. Everything. They've spent their entire lives in chains, believing that suppression was peace, that control was order. But they're about to learn that peace doesn't come from control. It comes from chaos, from choice. It comes from the freedom to feel everything, good, bad, ugly, beautiful, and still be able to function. Still be able to live. The revolution wasn't fought with guns or bombs. At least not at first. It was fought with words, with ideas, with emotions. A revolution of the mind, a rebellion of the heart. It started when a few scattered groups, individuals who had discarded their implants or whose emotional inhibitors had malfunctioned, began speaking out. They whispered on street corners, they gathered in underground spaces, and they shared their experiences, the first moments of true feeling they had ever experienced. Fear, love, rage, joy, real emotion. And it spread like wildfire. In a society where emotional expression had been a crime, the smallest act of rebellion, an outburst of laughter, a tear shed in public, became an act of revolution. People began to question everything they had been told, everything they had believed in. The government, the empire, the very foundation of their existence had been built on a lie. And now, that lie was being exposed, piece by piece. Zarek, ever the catalyst, found himself at the center of this uprising. He hadn't meant to be a leader. He didn't want to be one. But in this moment, when everything was changing, when society was bending and shifting under the weight of its own emotional upheaval, he was exactly where he needed to be. What do you want them to feel? Kara asked him one night, as they sat in the darkened safe house, the only light coming from the faint glow of the city below. Zarek's thoughts drifted for a moment before he answered, his voice quiet, contemplative. I want them to feel everything. The full spectrum. The highs, the lows, the in-betweens. Because until they do, they'll never truly understand what it means to be free. Kara didn't respond right away. She was a biochemist by training, and now, as they fought this unseen battle against the emotional suppression systems, she had become one of Zarek's closest allies. Her mind was sharp, analytical, but even she couldn't deny the power of the changes happening around them. You think they're ready for it? Kara asked, her voice tinged with doubt. Zarek turned to face her, his eyes unwavering. Ready or not, it's happening. You can't unfeel something once you've felt it. And Veleria. Veleria is about to feel everything. In the heart of the Empire, the transformation was already underway. The streets once filled with hushed, muted figures, emotionless, expressionless, were now alive with color, with noise, with a cacophony of human existence. People laughed, shouted, argued, cried, and loved, really loved. They weren't perfect, but they were real. But with this newfound freedom came uncertainty. And with uncertainty came fear. The Zephyria Council, the ones who had worked so hard to build their empire on the foundation of emotional suppression, watched in horror as their citizens began to crumble. They had always known control was fragile. But they had never imagined it could break so easily. The council moved quickly to try and suppress the uprising, deploying security forces and drones to silence the cries of rebellion. But no matter how hard they tried, the message was already out. The people had tasted freedom, and they would never go back to the life they had lived before. Zarek couldn't help but marvel at the irony of it all. In fighting for freedom, in encouraging the Zephyria people to embrace their emotions, he had unwittingly caused the very thing they feared most. The empire had built itself on stability, on order, on the complete suppression of what made them human. But now, in their desperate attempts to restore control, the Zephyria Council was proving Zarek's point. True peace could never come from suppressing the human experience, it came from learning to navigate it. The balance between freedom and control wasn't one where freedom was locked away for the sake of stability. It was one where both could exist side by side, where emotional expression wasn't something to be feared but something to be celebrated. And now, the Zephyrias had to learn that the real revolution wasn't just a political one. It was a personal one. It was about embracing the chaos of being human and finding the courage to live through it. The revolution had started small, a spark in the darkness, but it had burned its way through Veleria's carefully constructed systems of control. Now, as Zarek stood in the remnants of the Empire, a strange sense of peace settled over him, almost like the calm that follows a storm, but knowing that the storm was far from over. The transformation was just beginning, and what came next could shape not only the future of Veleria but the very fabric of its society. Zarek had come to realize that revolutions, true revolutions, weren't just about overthrowing governments. They were about ideas. About changing the way people thought, the way they lived, the way they felt. And as much as the Empire had tried to suppress those feelings, they had seeped through the cracks, transforming the Empire from the inside out. The battle was no longer against the government, but against the very ideals that had held it together for centuries. The streets of the capital were alive with the hum of change, but it wasn't clean or organized. It was chaotic, messy, uncertain. People were discovering emotions they had never known. They were laughing, crying, fighting, really fighting, not in the sense of rebellion but in the sense of living. It was the unfiltered chaos of life, and it was terrifying to witness. Zarek had taken a back seat in the last few weeks. His role as a catalyst, as the one who had sparked the fire, was done. It was now up to the Zephyria people to carry it forward, to decide how they would move on from the wreckage of their old empire. And yet, Zarek couldn't shake the feeling that he was still very much a part of it. The explosion in the palace had been the first domino to fall, but it wasn't the last. The ripple effects were everywhere, and they were reaching him, too. He found himself spending more time with Empress Lyra, who had become a different person over the course of this transformation. She had shed much of her former self, the icy, calculated monarch who had ruled with an iron fist. That person was still there, hidden beneath the surface, but there was something else now. Something more human. They didn't speak of the revolution often. Instead, they talked about what came next, about what could come next. And in these moments, in the quiet of their conversations, there was an unspoken understanding between them. An acknowledgement that their bond, the connection they had discovered through chaos and vulnerability, was now as much a part of the Empire's future as anything else. It wasn't all beauty and hope, though. The cracks in society were wide. People were struggling. The newly awakened emotions brought with them a flood of uncertainty. The Zephyria people, who had never known how to process their feelings, were now faced with the raw intensity of what it meant to feel. Some embraced it, flourishing in the newfound freedom. Others cracked under the pressure, unable to cope with the flood of emotions. The chaos had bred violence, and in some areas, it was rampant. It wasn't the explosion of power that the Council had feared, it was the emotional instability, the wildness of humanity that couldn't be contained. People fought, not for power, but for the right to feel without fear. It was messy. It was painful. But it was alive. Zarek saw it everywhere he went, the stark contrast between those who had embraced the new world and those who had retreated into the past. Some had taken to the streets, trying to restore order, trying to re-establish the systems of control that had once kept the peace. Others had turned inward, burying their emotions once again, trying to find a way to live with the flood of feeling that had overwhelmed them. It wasn't easy. It was never going to be easy. But Zarek knew that the true test of this new world wasn't in the chaos, it was in the balance that had to be struck between freedom and control, between emotion and reason. The answer wasn't to suppress, but to allow people to feel, to learn, to grow with their emotions, and to find a way to navigate the messiness of human existence without collapsing into destruction. The palace was quieter these days. The hustle of government had slowed, and the once rigid corridors of power were now infused with a new energy, an energy that came from the people, from the streets, from the very fabric of the empire itself. But that energy was still wild, untamed, and it made Lyra uneasy. Zarek could see it in her eyes. The uncertainty. The fear. She had never known a world without control. She had never had to navigate a world where anything could happen. Where emotions could run unchecked, where the rules weren't written in stone, where people could make their own choices. "You look like you're lost in thought," Zarek said one evening, as they sat on the balcony of the palace, watching the stars begin to twinkle above. He could feel the shift in her presence, the way her energy had changed. She was no longer the empress who had ruled with absolute certainty. She was something else now, something softer, something more human. Lyra sighed, leaning against the railing. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 decisions. "For so long, I've ruled over this empire with the belief that stability could only come from control. Now I don't know if control was ever the answer. But I don't know how to lead without it." Zarek's voice was gentle, almost tender. "You lead by allowing people to choose. To make mistakes, to learn from them. It's not going to be easy. But that's the price of freedom. The price of life." Lyra met his gaze, her eyes dark with uncertainty. "What if they can't handle it? What if this feeling destroys everything we've worked for?" Zarek smiled, his expression soft but knowing. "What if it doesn't?" he asked. "What if it's the start of something better? Something real?" Lyra didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked out over the city, where lights flickered in the streets below, a reflection of the stars above. The people were changing. They were finding their own way. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't smooth. But it was alive. The future was still uncertain, but Zarek could feel something beginning to shift in the air. The Velerian Empire had been built on the idea that peace could only come through control, through the suppression of emotion. But now, with the revolution in full swing, the very foundation of that empire was crumbling. And in its place, a new world was beginning to emerge. A world that felt. A world that lived. Zarek had always believed that the ultimate revolution wasn't fought with weapons, but with ideas. And in this moment, as the Zephyria people struggled to find their footing in this new world of freedom, he realized the truth: peace could never be achieved through the suppression of human nature. It could only be found in the balance between freedom and guidance. The chaos of emotion was necessary for growth, necessary for understanding. But it needed structure, too. It needed guidance. Without that balance, there could be no peace. Without the willingness to let people feel, to let them live, the empire would never find true stability. The revolution, Zarek realized, had just begun.